Hello, and welcome. Settle in, let your shoulders drop, and let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're traveling somewhere distant, somewhere often misunderstood. We're going to feudal Japan, not the Japan of movie swords and shadowy assassins, but the real one. The quieter one. The one where samurai were bureaucrats, ninjas were farmers, and honor was more paperwork than poetry. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let the images form softly in your mind. And let's walk together through the mist, back to a time that Hollywood got just a little bit wrong. Let's begin with the samurai. You've seen them, haven't you? In films, in games, in paintings. They stand tall, sword gleaming, face stern beneath a crested helmet. They live by the blade. They die by honor. They are warriors, first and always. But here's the truth, soft and steady as falling snow. For most of their history, samurai were not warriors. They were administrators, tax collectors, estate managers. Men who spent more time with brushes than with blades. Picture this. It's a quiet morning in the early Edo period, sometime around the year 1650. The sun is just beginning to filter through the paper screens of a modest home in a castle town. A samurai named Takeda wakes, not to the clash of steel, but to the rustle of his wife preparing tea in the next room. He dresses carefully. Not in armor. Armor is heavy, expensive, and entirely unnecessary today, but in a simple dark kimono and hakama trousers. His hair is tied back. His face is calm. He eats a small breakfast. Rice. Pickled vegetables. Miso soup, still steaming. And then he picks up his sword, not to fight, but because it is part of his identity, his legal status. Samurai are required to carry swords. It marks them as part of the ruling class. But Takeda hasn't drawn his blade in anger in years. Maybe never. He walks through the quiet streets. Other samurai nod as they pass. Merchants bow low. It is a world of strict hierarchy, and everyone knows their place. Takeda arrives at the castle not to prepare for battle, but to sit in a small office with scrolls stacked high around him. Today, he will review tax records from 3 villages. He will write reports. He will consult with other officials about a dispute over water rights. This is the life of most samurai during the long peace of the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868. For over 2.5 centuries, Japan was unified, stable, and mostly at peace. There were no great wars. No foreign invasions. The samurai, who had once been mounted archers and battlefield commanders, became something else entirely, a hereditary bureaucracy. They were still elite. Still respected. But their world was one of ink, not blood. Of course, they trained. Swordsmanship was still taught, still valued. But it became more like calligraphy or tea ceremony, a refined art, a discipline of the spirit. It was about self-cultivation, not survival. Many samurai never fought a real duel. Many never saw combat. And yet the myths persisted. Why? Partly because of the samurai themselves. They wrote their own stories. They idealized their past. They spoke of loyalty, of honor, of bushido, the way of the warrior. But bushido, as a formal code, was largely invented after the samurai had already become civil servants. It was nostalgia dressed as tradition. A longing for a past that had been, perhaps, more brutal and chaotic than anyone cared to admit. So when you think of a samurai, think of Takeda. Think of the man who wakes early, eats his rice, walks through town with a sword he rarely draws, and spends his day bent over paperwork in a quiet room. The sword is there. The status is real. But the life? It is slow, methodical, and far more human than legend allows. And outside, the morning light grows warmer. The castle town hums softly with the footsteps of merchants and farmers, and somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rings, low and steady. Now let's talk about ninjas. Or shinobi, as they were called. Close your eyes and imagine a figure in black, face covered, moving soundlessly across rooftops, throwing stars glinting in moonlight, vanishing into smoke. A master of assassination, of shadow, of the impossible. It's a wonderful image. And it's almost entirely fiction. The real ninja, the real shinobi, were far stranger, and far more ordinary, than that. They were not a secret brotherhood of assassins. They were not trained from birth in hidden mountain fortresses. They were, most often, simply people trying to survive in a world that did not favor them. Farmers. Mercenaries. Local guides. People who knew the land, who could move quietly, who were willing to do the dangerous, unglamorous work that samurai would not. Let's visit the province of Ukiyo-e, in central Japan, sometime in the late 1500s. This is mountainous country, rugged and remote. The people here are independent, suspicious of outsiders. They are not part of any great lord's domain. They govern themselves, loosely, through village councils. And when the great warlords, men like Oda Nobunaga, begin their campaigns to unify Japan, the people of Ukiyo-e find themselves in danger. They cannot field large armies. They do not have samurai retainers or castles. What they have is knowledge. They know every path through the mountains. They know how to move unseen. They know which plants are poisonous, which signals carry farthest, how to start a fire without smoke. These are the skills of farmers and hunters, turned to the purpose of war. So when the warlords come, the people of Ukiyo-e resist. Not with battles, but with ambushes. With sabotage. With intelligence gathering. They send scouts to watch enemy camps. They set traps on mountain trails. They strike quickly, then disappear into the forest. This is guerrilla warfare, born of necessity. And it works for a while. But eventually, Nobunaga grows tired of this resistance. In 1581, he sends an overwhelming force into Ukiyo-e. The villages burn. Many of the inhabitants are killed. The survivors scatter. Some flee to other provinces. Some offer their services as spies and scouts to the very warlords who destroyed their homes. Because this is survival. This is pragmatism. These survivors, these displaced people of Ukiyo-e and the neighboring province of Koga, become the foundation of the ninja legend. They are hired by lords who need information, who need sabotage, who need someone to do the work that samurai, bound by codes of honor and public reputation, cannot. The shinobi are not glamorous. They are not respected. They are tools. Useful, dangerous, and disposable. They do not wear black uniforms. In fact, they dress like anyone else, farmers, merchants, monks, whatever allows them to blend in. The iconic black outfit? That comes much later, from the kabuki theater of the Edo period, where stagehands dressed in black to signal that they were invisible. When ninja characters were added to plays, they wore the same black costumes, and the association stuck. The throwing stars, the shuriken, were real, but rare. Far more common were simple weapons, a sickle, a length of chain, a wooden staff. Things that could be explained away, that didn't mark you as a warrior. And the techniques? They were practical. How to pick a lock. How to listen at a wall. How to make a distraction. How to remember a message and deliver it across enemy lines. There was no mysticism. No magic. Just skill, desperation, and the kind of courage that doesn't get written into songs. By the Edo period, when the wars ended and the samurai became bureaucrats, the shinobi faded even further. Some found work as security consultants, teaching lords how to protect their castles from infiltration. Some wrote manuals, documenting their techniques, manuals that mixed practical advice with exaggeration, with stories meant to intimidate and impress. And from these manuals, and from the plays, and from the fading memories of old wars, the myth grew. The ninja became shadows. Became legends. Became something they had never quite been. But if you had met a real shinobi, someone like a survivor from IGA, working quietly in the service of a distant lord, you would have seen something else. Not a demon, but a person. Someone tired. Someone clever. Someone trying, in a hard world, to stay alive. And the mountains of IGA, even now, remain quiet, the paths overgrown, the old villages long gone, but the wind still moves through the trees, soft and relentless. Now we come to Bushido. The way of the warrior. You've heard of it, surely. Loyalty unto death. Honor above all. The samurai who would rather die than face disgrace. The warrior who serves his lord with absolute, unquestioning devotion. It's a powerful idea. A beautiful one, even. But here's the quiet truth. Bushido, as we know it, was largely invented in the 19th century. Long after the samurai had stopped fighting. Long after the age of war had ended. Let's go back to the Edo period again, that long, peaceful stretch from 1603 to 1868. The samurai are administrators now, remember. They live on stipends from their lords. They study poetry, calligraphy, Confucian philosophy. They marry, raise children, worry about money. They are, in many ways, just like any other hereditary elite in any other peaceful society. But there's a problem. The samurai define themselves as warriors. Their status, their privileges, their entire identity is tied to the idea that they are fighters. That they are brave. That they are different from commoners. And yet, they are not fighting. Most of them will never fight. So what does it mean to be a samurai, if there is no war? This is the question that haunts the samurai of the Edo period. And the answer they come up with is bushido. Not as a code they follow, but as a code they invent, retroactively, to justify their existence. They look back at the wars of the past, wars that were chaotic, brutal, full of betrayal and pragmatism, and they tell cleaner stories. Stories of loyalty. Of honor. Of warriors who valued their reputation more than their lives. One of the most famous texts of Bushido is the Hagakure, written in the early 1700s by a man named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. It's full of bold, dramatic statements. The way of the samurai is found in death. A warrior should live as though his body were already dead. It sounds profound. It sounds ancient. But here's the thing, Tsunetomo was not a warrior. He was a retainer who had spent most of his life in peaceful service. After his lord died, he retired to a hermitage and dictated his thoughts to a younger samurai. The Hagakure is not a battlefield manual. It is the reflections of an old man, nostalgic for a past he never experienced, trying to make sense of a world that no longer needs warriors. And for most of the Edo period, the Hagakure was obscure. Few people read it. It was not considered particularly important. It wasn't until much later, in the late 1800s, after the samurai class had been abolished and Japan was modernizing rapidly, that Bushido became a national ideology. The Meiji government, trying to build a modern military and instill discipline and loyalty in its soldiers, reached back into samurai history and pulled out these ideals. They taught Bushido in schools. They wrote books about it. They turned it into a tool of nationalism. And then, in the 20th century, Bushido became something even darker. During World War II, it was used to justify kamikaze attacks, to glorify death in battle, to convince young soldiers that surrender was the ultimate shame. Bushido, the beautiful lie, became a weapon. But let's return to the Edo period, to a quieter time. Imagine a samurai, let's call him Sato. He's in his 40s. He lives in a modest house in a castle town. He has 2 children. He teaches them to read, to write, to understand the Confucian classics. He tells them stories of great warriors from the past, warriors like Minamoto Yoshitsune, like Kusunoki Masashige, but he also teaches them practicality. He teaches them that loyalty is important, but survival is too. That honor matters, but so does wisdom. Sato has a sword. 2 swords, in fact, a long one and a short one. He cleans them regularly. He practices kata, the formal sword movements, in the courtyard behind his house. But he does this not because he expects to fight, but because it is tradition. Because it is meditative. Because it connects him to something larger than himself. He is a good man. A conscientious one. But he is not the samurai of legend. He will not die for his lord. His lord is a distant figure, someone he sees perhaps once a year. He will not commit seppuku over a point of honor. He has children to raise, responsibilities to fulfill. He is, in short, human. And that is what the myth of bushido often erases: the humanity, the complexity, the quiet, ordinary lives lived in the shadow of an impossible ideal. And the evening comes softly to the castle town, lanterns are lit, one by one, and Sato finishes his practice, sheathes his sword, and goes inside for dinner. Let's step outside now, into the world that surrounded the samurai and the shinobi. Let's walk through a castle town in the mid-Edo period, perhaps around 1700. The wars are long over. The streets are safe. The world is ordered, rigidly so, and everyone knows their place. The town is built in concentric circles around the castle. At the very center, perched on a hill or raised earthworks, is the castle itself, white walls, dark tile roofs, elegant and imposing. This is where the daimyo lives, the feudal lord who governs this domain. He is a powerful man, but also a captive one. The shogun in Edo, what we now call Tokyo, requires him to spend every other year in the capital, leaving his family behind as hostages. It is a system designed to prevent rebellion, and it works. Around the castle, closest to its walls, live the samurai. Their homes are arranged according to rank. The highest-ranking retainers have large estates with gardens and gates. The lower-ranking samurai live in smaller row houses, neat and uniform. Some are so poor they can barely afford to maintain their swords and formal clothing. But they are still samurai. They still carry their 2 swords. They still bow to no one but those above them in the hierarchy. Beyond the samurai district are the townspeople, the chonin. Merchants, artisans, shopkeepers. Legally, they are ranked below the samurai, below even the farmers. But in practice, many of them are far wealthier. They cannot carry swords. They cannot wear certain colors or fabrics. But they can trade, and they can accumulate money in ways the samurai, on their fixed stipends, cannot. Walk down one of these streets. It is mid-morning. The shops are open. A man sells rice crackers, calling out softly to passers-by. A woman arranges bolts of cloth in a storefront. A carpenter's apprentice carries a bundle of wood, balanced carefully on his shoulder. The street smells of soy sauce, of sawdust, of the faint char of a charcoal brazier. There is a rhythm to this world. A predictability. The day is divided not just by the sun, but by the ringing of bells from the local temple. Work begins early. Meals are simple. Evenings are quiet. And yet, beneath this order, there is tension. The samurai resent the merchants for their wealth. The merchants resent the samurai for their arrogance, their legal privileges. The farmers, who live outside the town and the surrounding countryside, resent everyone. They are taxed heavily, bound to the land, forbidden from leaving without permission. They grow the rice that feeds the entire system, and they are the lowest in status except for the outcasts, the eta and hinin, who do the work considered impure, tanning leather, handling corpses, sweeping the streets. But for now, in this moment, the town is peaceful. A vegetable seller pushes a cart down the street. A dog trots past, nosing at a scrap of food. Somewhere in the distance, a shamisen, a 3-stringed instrument, plays a slow, melancholic tune. This is the world of feudal Japan. Not a world of constant war and drama, but a world of structure, of routine, of small beauties and small cruelties. A world where a samurai might spend his afternoon copying legal documents, where a merchant might spend years saving to buy a single fine kimono, where a farmer might look up at the castle on the hill and feel both pride and bitterness. It is a world that will last, in this form, for over 200 years. A world so stable that it begins to feel eternal. But it is not. Change is coming, though no one in this town, on this quiet morning, can see it yet. The shogunate is weakening. Foreign ships are appearing on the horizon. Ideas are spreading, ideas about equality, about progress, about a world beyond the strict boundaries of domain and status. And when the change comes, it will come suddenly, and it will sweep this entire world away. But for now, the town endures. The sun climbs higher. The temple bell rings. And life continues, slow and steady, like the turning of the seasons. And somewhere, a samurai walks home from the castle, his work finished for the day, and a merchant locks his shop, counting the day's coins, and a farmer, far outside the town, leans on his hoe and wipes his brow, looking toward the mountains where the light is just beginning to soften. Let's talk about seppuku, or harakiri, as it's sometimes called in the West. Ritual suicide. The ultimate expression of samurai honor. A warrior, disgraced or defeated, kneels in a quiet room. He picks up a short blade. And with calm, unflinching resolve, he opens his own belly. It's one of the most iconic images of feudal Japan. And like so much else, it's misunderstood. Seppuku did happen. That part is real. But it was not common. It was not casual. And it was not, for most of history, treated as honorable or noble. It was desperate. It was shameful. It was something done only in the most extreme circumstances. Let's go back to the Sengoku period, the age of civil war, roughly from 1467 to 1600. This is a brutal time. Lords betray each other. Castles fall. Armies clash in the mud and rain. And when a lord is defeated, truly defeated, with no hope of escape or mercy, he might choose seppuku. Not as an act of honor, but as a way to control his own death. To deny his enemies the satisfaction of executing him. To die on his own terms. It is painful. It is bloody. And it is often not done alone. A trusted retainer stands behind the man committing seppuku, sword raised. As soon as the blade enters the belly, the retainer strikes, one swift blow to the neck, severing the head. This is called kaishaku, and it is an act of mercy. Because disembowelment does not kill quickly. It can take minutes, even hours. The kaishaku ends the suffering. But even this highly ritualized, highly controlled death, was rare. Most warriors who were defeated did not commit seppuku. They surrendered. They negotiated. They fled. Some switched sides. Some became monks. Some simply disappeared into the countryside and tried to start new lives. And then, in the Edo period, seppuku changes. It becomes more formalized. More symbolic. The Tokugawa shogunate, the ruling government, begins to use seppuku as a form of capital punishment for samurai who have committed crimes. A samurai cannot be executed like a commoner. That would be too shameful. Instead, he is ordered to commit seppuku. It is framed as a privilege, a way to preserve his honor. But make no mistake, it is still an execution. And the ritual becomes more elaborate. The condemned man is given time to prepare. He bathes. He dresses in white, the color of death. He is brought to a designated place, often a temple or a garden. Witnesses gather. He is given sake, though he often does not drink it. He kneels on a white cloth. Before him is a tray, and on the tray is a short blade, sometimes wrapped in white paper. He recites a death poem, if he has prepared one. He bows. He takes the blade. And then, sometimes, he only mimes the motion. Because by this time, by the 18th century, the actual cutting has become almost optional. The kaishaku strikes as soon as the condemned man reaches for the blade, or even before. The form is preserved, but the suffering is minimized. This is seppuku as theater. Seppuku as bureaucracy. It is no longer about desperation or defiance. It is about maintaining the appearance of honor within a system that is deeply controlled, deeply regulated. And yet the myth grows. Stories are told of warriors who performed seppuku with perfect calm, with no sign of pain, who delivered profound final words and died with dignity intact. These stories are repeated, embellished, turned into examples for future generations. They become part of the bushido mythology. But here is the truth: seppuku was horrifying. It was tragic. And most people, samurai included, did everything they could to avoid it. It was not a beautiful act. It was a desperate one, or a coerced one, or a political one. The beauty was imposed later, by those who wanted to believe that death could be noble, that suffering could have meaning. Imagine a samurai in the Edo period, a minor retainer who has made a serious mistake, perhaps struck a superior in anger. He is summoned. He is told he must commit seppuku. He is terrified. He does not want to die. But he has no choice. Refusal would mean his family would be punished, their property confiscated. So he goes through the ritual. He says the words. He kneels on the white cloth. And he hopes, he prays, that the kaishaku will be swift, that the end will come before the pain becomes unbearable. This is the reality behind the ritual. Not honor but fear. Not dignity, but survival, if not for him, then for his family. And the garden is silent except for the rustling of leaves, and the witnesses bow their heads, and the blade rests on the tray, cold and still. Let's leave the samurai now and step into a different world. A brighter one, though no less complicated. This is the world of the Chonin, the townspeople of Edo, the great city that will one day become Tokyo. This is the world of the floating world, the ukiyo-e. The term, floating world, is poetic. It comes from Buddhism, from the idea that life is transient, fleeting, like a dream. But in the Edo period, it takes on a new meaning. The floating world is the world of pleasure. Of theater and tea houses, of courtesans and kabuki actors, of woodblock prints and poetry. It is a world where beauty is bought and sold, where art flourishes in the space between respectability and scandal. Edo is enormous. By the 18th century, it is one of the largest cities in the world, with over 1 million people. It sprawls along the edge of a great bay, a maze of canals and bridges, of wooden houses packed tightly together. Fires are common, the city burns and rebuilds, again and again. But it grows. It thrives. And in the heart of the city, in districts like Yoshiwara, the floating world blooms. Yoshiwara is the licensed pleasure quarter. It is walled, gated, separate from the rest of the city. Officially, it is a place of strict regulations. Unofficially, it is where the rules bend. Samurai are not supposed to go there, it is beneath their dignity. But they go anyway, dressed in plain clothes, hoping not to be recognized. Merchants go. Artisans go. Everyone goes, if they can afford it. Inside Yoshiwara, the streets glow with lanterns. The air smells of incense and perfume. Music drifts from the tea houses, the plucking of shamisen, the high, delicate voices of singers. The courtesans, called oiran if they are high-ranking, wear elaborate kimonos, layer upon layer of silk. Their hair is piled high, studded with ornaments. They move slowly, gracefully, on tall wooden sandals. They are performers as much as anything else. To spend time with an oiran is expensive, complicated, wrapped in ritual. It is not just about physical pleasure. It is about conversation, about wit, about the performance of refinement. But not all courtesans are oiran. Most are not. Most are ordinary women, indentured by debt, working in smaller houses, hoping to earn enough to buy their freedom. It is a hard life. A short life, often. Disease is common. The work is exhausting. And yet, for some, It is better than the alternatives: the grinding poverty of the countryside, the brutal labor of the fields. The floating world is full of contradictions. It is beautiful and exploitative. It is a place of art and of suffering. It is celebrated in poems and paintings, and it is deeply controlled by law and economics. And beyond the pleasure quarters, there is kabuki, the great theater of the common people. Kabuki is loud, colorful, dramatic. The actors wear elaborate makeup and costumes. They perform stories of loyalty and revenge, of star-crossed lovers and noble warriors. The audience is rowdy. They shout, they cheer, they throw coins onto the stage. It is nothing like the refined, subtle no theater of the samurai. Kabuki is for everyone. And the actors, especially the onagata, the men who specialize in playing women, become celebrities. People know their names. People follow their careers. Woodblock prints of famous actors are sold in shops, collected, admired. This is the beginning of popular culture. This is the beginning of fandom. The prints themselves, ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, are everywhere. They are cheap, mass-produced. They depict actors, courtesans, landscapes, scenes from daily life. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige will later become world-famous, but in their own time, they are craftsmen, producing art for the masses. The prints are beautiful, yes, but they are also disposable. People use them to wrap fish. They paste them on walls. They are not high art, not yet. But they are loved. And they spread. And eventually, they will travel across the ocean, and European artists, impressionists like Monet and Van Gogh, will see them and be astonished. They will call this art Japanism, and they will imitate it, borrow from it, be transformed by it. But that is later. For now, in Edo, in the floating world, the prints are simply part of life. Part of the color and noise and beauty of a city that is always moving, always changing. And the evening deepens, the lanterns in Yoshiwara glow brighter against the gathering dark, a shamisen player pauses between songs, fingers resting on the strings, and somewhere in the city, a kabuki performance reaches its climax, and the audience roars with delight. Now let's talk about Japan's isolation. For over 200 years, from the 1630s until the 1850s, Japan was closed. The borders were sealed. No Japanese could leave. No foreigners could enter, except for a small number of Dutch and Chinese traders, and they were confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. This was the policy of Sakoku, the closed country. It is often described as total isolation. But that's not quite true. Information still flowed. Ideas still traveled. But slowly. Carefully. Filtered through the shogunate's control. Why did Japan close itself? The answer is fear. Fear of Christianity, fear of colonization, fear of chaos. In the late 1500s, European traders, Portuguese and Spanish, had arrived in Japan. They brought guns, which changed warfare. They brought Christianity, which spread rapidly. By the early 1600s, there were hundreds of thousands of Christian converts in Japan, especially in the southern island of Kyushu. The Tokugawa shogunate, newly established and still consolidating power, saw this as a threat. Christianity taught that there was a higher authority than the shogun, God, and the Pope. Christian converts might feel loyalty to something beyond Japan, beyond the feudal order. And European powers, Spain, Portugal, were colonizing other parts of Asia. What if they tried the same in Japan? So the shogunate acted. First, they banned Christianity. Missionaries were expelled. Converts were forced to renounce their faith. Those who refused were tortured, killed. In 1637, a massive peasant rebellion broke out in Shimabara, in Kyushu. Tens of thousands of people, many of them Christian, rose up against their lords. The shogunate crushed the rebellion with overwhelming force. Thousands died. And then, the borders closed. Japanese ships were forbidden from sailing to foreign countries. Foreign ships were forbidden from entering Japanese ports, except in Nagasaki, and under strict supervision. Christianity was hunted relentlessly. Suspected Christians were forced to step on images of Jesus or Mary, fumi, they were called, to prove they had renounced the faith. And for over 2 centuries, this was the world. Japan alone. But what was it like, this isolation? Was it peaceful? Was it stifling? In some ways, it was both. The lack of foreign war meant stability. The economy grew. Cities flourished. Culture bloomed: kabuki, ukiyo-e, haiku, tea ceremony, ikebana. Japan turned inward, and in that inwardness, it refined itself. But there was also stagnation. The samurai, as we've discussed, had no wars to fight. The rigid class system meant that mobility was almost impossible. You were born a farmer, you died a farmer. Born a merchant, died a merchant. Innovation was discouraged. The Tokugawa shogunate valued order above all else. And there was curiosity. Despite the closed borders, there were always those who wondered about the world beyond. In Nagasaki, a small group of scholars studied Dutch books, medical texts, astronomy, maps. This was called rangaku, Dutch learning. It was technically illegal, or at least suspicious, but it was tolerated. These scholars learned that the world was much larger, much stranger, than they had imagined. They learned about blood circulation, about the moons of Jupiter, about the American Revolution. But for most people, the outside world was a rumor. A story. Japan was the center. Everything else was distant, irrelevant. And then, in 1853, everything changed. 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay. American ships led by Commodore Matthew Perry. They were steamships, massive, metal, belching smoke. Nothing like the wooden ships Japan knew. They carried cannons. They carried a letter from the American president, demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. The shogunate was paralyzed. They had no navy that could challenge these ships. They had no idea how to respond. Perry left, promising to return the next year for an answer. And when he did return, Japan opened. Not willingly, but because there was no choice. The age of isolation was over. The opening of Japan is often portrayed as a moment of awakening, of progress. And in some ways it was. Japan would modernize rapidly, would become a world power within a few decades. But it was also a trauma. The entire structure of society, the shogunate, the samurai class, the careful order of the Edo period, would collapse within 15 years. The samurai would lose their stipends, their swords, their status. The daimyo would lose their domains. The emperor, who had been a figurehead for centuries, would be restored to power. And Japan would enter the modern world with a mixture of ambition, desperation, and fury. But that is another story. For now, imagine that moment in 1853. Imagine the people of Edo, looking out at the bay, seeing those black ships. Imagine the fear, the confusion, the slow dawning realization that the world they knew, the world that had seemed so solid, so eternal, was ending. And the waves lap against the shore, and the smoke from the ships drifts across the water, and the city holds its breath. Let's turn now to a question often overlooked: where were the women? In all these stories, of samurai and ninjas, of castles and theaters, women are rarely mentioned. They are in the background. Supporting characters. Wives, mothers, courtesans. But what were their lives actually like? What power did they have? What choices? The answer is, it's complicated. In feudal Japan, as in most pre-modern societies, women had limited legal rights. They could not inherit property in the same way men could. They could not hold official positions. Their primary role was defined by the family, as daughters, as wives, as mothers. Their value was in the alliances they could create, the heirs they could produce, the households they could manage. But within these constraints, there was variety. There was agency. There were women who wielded real power, though it was often quiet power, exercised behind the scenes. Let's start with the samurai class. A samurai wife, often called an okuzan, or onabi geisha if she was trained in martial arts, ran the household. This was not a trivial role. The household was the economic and social unit. She managed the servants. She oversaw the finances. She educated the children. And if her husband was away, and many samurai spent long periods away from home, serving their lord or fulfilling their alternate year duty in Edo, she was in charge. Some samurai women were trained in combat. Not extensively, but enough to defend the household if necessary. They learned to use the naginata, a polearm, and sometimes the tanto, a short dagger. There are records, though they are rare, of women fighting in battles, defending castles, leading troops. But these are exceptions. For most samurai women, combat training was symbolic, a mark of status, not a practical skill. And yet, they were not helpless. They were educated. They could read and write. Some were poets. Some were scholars. They participated in tea ceremonies, in flower arranging, in the cultural life of the samurai class. But they were also constrained. Marriage was a tool of alliance, not of love. Divorce was possible, but difficult. A woman who left her husband's household brought shame to her family. And if her husband died, her position became precarious. She might return to her birth family, if they would take her. She might become a nun. Or she might remarry, though this was less common among the samurai class. Now let's look at the townspeople, the chonin. Among merchants and artisans, women often worked. They ran shops. They managed accounts. Widows, especially, could inherit businesses and run them successfully. There are records of female merchants who became wealthy, who commanded respect in their communities. But again, this was within limits. Women could work, but they could not hold guild positions. They could own property, but their legal rights were weaker than men's. They were essential to the economy, but invisible in the formal structures of power. And then there are the women of the pleasure quarters, the courtesans we discussed earlier. Their lives were hard. Most were indentured, sold into service by their families to pay off debts. They worked until they had earned enough to buy their freedom, or until they were too old or too sick to work. A few, the most talented, the most beautiful, became famous, wealthy even. But most did not. And yet, within the floating world, courtesans had a certain status. They were artists. They were cultural figures. They set fashions. The highest-ranking oiran could refuse clients, could choose their companions. This was not freedom, not in any real sense. But it was a kind of power. A narrow, precarious kind of power, but power nonetheless. And there were women outside these categories. Female entertainers, geisha, though that term came later. Female pilgrims, who traveled to temples and shrines. Female criminals, who were punished more harshly than men. Female outcasts, who lived on the margins of society. The point is this: women's lives in feudal Japan were constrained by law, by custom, by the structures of a deeply hierarchical society. But they were not uniform. They were not passive. Women found ways to navigate, to exert influence, to survive and sometimes to thrive. And yet, they were erased. Or rather, they were simplified. The image that survives, the image that Hollywood loves, is the demure wife, the seductive courtesan, the tragic figure. The complexity is lost. The individuality is lost. So when you think of feudal Japan, remember this: half the people living in those castle towns, those villages, those cities, were women. They were working, thinking, struggling, loving. They were there. They were always there. And the evening light filters through the paper screens, and a woman sits at a low table, brush in hand, writing a letter, and outside, the world moves on, indifferent to her quiet labor. Now we come to the end. Or rather, the beginning of the end. By the early 19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled Japan for over 200 years. The system seemed solid. The hierarchies were entrenched. The peace had held. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The economy was changing. The samurai, who lived on fixed rice stipends, were struggling. Prices were rising. Many samurai were in debt to the very merchants they looked down upon. Some were so poor they could barely afford to maintain their swords. There were whispers, dangerous whispers, of samurai selling their status, of commoners buying samurai rank with money. The merchants, meanwhile, were thriving. They controlled trade. They controlled credit. They were the real power in the cities, though they could never admit it openly. The rigid class system, samurai at the top, farmers second, artisans third, merchants last, no longer reflected reality. And the farmers? They were suffering. Taxes were heavy. Famines were common. In the 1780s, a massive famine killed tens of thousands. In the 1830s, another. The Tokugawa shogunate's legitimacy rested on its ability to maintain order, to provide stability. But it could not control the weather. It could not control the harvests. There were rebellions. Small ones, mostly. Peasant uprisings, quickly suppressed. But there were also more organized protests, ukiyo-e, they were called, where villagers would petition for tax relief, sometimes successfully. And there were urban riots, like the one in 1837 led by a samurai named Ashiohei Hakairo, who stormed Osaka in protest of the government's failure to aid the starving. He was defeated, killed, but the message was clear, the system was fraying. And then there was the problem of the West. Even before Perry's arrival, there had been incidents. Russian ships had appeared in the north. British ships had surveyed Japanese waters. In 1808, a British warship had forced its way into Nagasaki harbor, demanding supplies. The shogunate had been humiliated. It had no way to defend the coast. So there were debates. Scholars and officials argued about what to do. Some said Japan should modernize, should learn from the West, should build defenses. Others said Japan should remain pure, should expel the barbarians, should close the country even more tightly. These were not abstract debates. They were desperate, urgent, full of fear. And then, Perry arrived. And Japan opened. The shogunate signed treaties, unequal treaties, heavily favoring the Western powers. Japan was forced to open ports, to allow trade, to grant extraterritorial rights to foreigners. The shogunate had failed in its most basic duty, to protect Japan. And this failure broke the shogunate. Within 15 years of Perry's arrival, the Tokugawa shogunate would be overthrown. The emperor, who had been a symbolic figure for centuries, would be restored to power, though in reality, power was seized by a group of lower-ranking samurai and court nobles who saw the shogunate as weak, as corrupt, as incapable. This was the Meiji Restoration of 1868. It is often portrayed as a revolution, as a moment of national awakening. And in some ways it was. Japan modernized with astonishing speed. Within a few decades it had a constitution, a parliament, a modern army and navy, railroads, telegraphs, factories. But it was also a destruction. The samurai class was abolished. The wearing of swords was banned. The domains, the Han, were dissolved. The entire structure of feudal Japan, the world we've been exploring, was dismantled. For the samurai, this was a catastrophe. They lost their stipends. They lost their status. They lost their purpose. Some adapted. Some became bureaucrats, officers, businessmen. Others did not. There were samurai rebellions, most famously, the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Restoration who had become disillusioned with the new government. The rebellion was crushed. Seigo died. And with him, the age of the samurai truly ended. And what replaced it? A new Japan. An industrialized Japan. An imperialist Japan. A Japan that would conquer Korea, defeat Russia, annex Taiwan, occupy Manchuria. A Japan that would, in the 20th century, bring both astonishing progress and unspeakable horror. But that, too, is another story. For now, let's stay in that moment of transition. The 1860s. The old world is dying. The new world is not yet born. Samurai walk the streets in their traditional clothing, but they see foreigners now, wearing Western suits. They see steam engines. They see gaslight. And they don't know if this is progress or apocalypse. Imagine one of them, a middle-aged samurai, a minor retainer. He stands on a hill overlooking Edo, which will soon be renamed Tokyo. The city is changing. Buildings are being torn down, rebuilt. Western-style structures are appearing. And he feels, what? Anger? Grief? Confusion? He touches the hilt of his sword, the sword he will not be allowed to carry much longer. And the wind blows across the city, carrying the smell of coal smoke, of new things, and the old world fades, like mist in the morning sun. So what remains? What is left of feudal Japan, now that we've pulled back the myths, now that we've seen the complexity beneath the stereotypes? The samurai were not all warriors. The ninjas were not all assassins. Bushido was invented after the fact. The isolation was not total. The society was not unchanging. And yet, the myths persist. Why? Partly because myths are useful. They are simple. They are dramatic. They give us heroes and villains, codes and honor, things we can hold on to in a complicated world. But partly, too, because there is truth in the myths. Not literal truth, but emotional truth. The samurai did value loyalty, even if they also valued survival. The shinobi were resourceful, even if they were not magical. Feudal Japan was a world of structure, of beauty, of discipline, even if it was also a world of suffering and rigidity. And that world shaped modern Japan. You can still see it, if you know where to look. In the reverence for craftsmanship. In the attention to detail. In the sense of obligation, Deary it's called, that still influences how people think about relationships, about duty, about work. But you can also see the costs. The rigidity. The difficulty of change. The way hierarchy can become oppressive. The way nostalgia can become dangerous. During World War II, the Japanese government invoked bushido, invoked the samurai spirit, to justify militarism and conquest. They told young soldiers that death was glorious, that surrender was shameful. And many believed it. Many died for it. The myth, weaponized, became a tragedy. And after the war, Japan rejected much of that mythology. But it didn't disappear. It transformed. It became entertainment. Samurai films. Anime. Video games. The myths spread around the world, more powerful than ever. And here we are. You listening to this, wherever you are. You've been told stories about samurai and ninjas. You've seen them in movies. And now you know a little more. You know that the stories were always more complicated, more human, than the myths allowed. Does that make them less interesting? I don't think so. I think it makes them more interesting. Because the truth is always stranger, always richer, than the simplifications. Feudal Japan was not a world of heroes and villains. It was a world of people. People trying to survive. Trying to find meaning. Trying to navigate systems that were often unjust, often absurd. People who were brave sometimes. Who were cowardly sometimes. Who were kind and cruel and everything in between. And that, I think, is worth remembering. Not the myths, but the people. So here is what I hope you take away, as you drift towards sleep. Feudal Japan was real. It was a real place, inhabited by real people, for hundreds of years. It was not a fantasy. It was not a theme park. It was messy and contradictory and human. The samurai who spent his days copying documents was as much a samurai as the warrior on the battlefield. The shinobi who survived the destruction of his village and lived to tell the tale was as much a ninja as any shadow assassin. The courtesan who wrote poetry in the floating world, the farmer who bent over his rice plants, the merchant who calculated his profits, the woman who raised her children in a castle town, they were all part of this world. And their lives mattered. Their struggles mattered. Even if they didn't fit the myths. Even if they weren't dramatic or heroic. History is not a collection of myths. It is a collection of lives. And every life is complicated. Every life is worth understanding. So let the myths go, gently, like leaves on a stream. Let them float away. And hold instead to the people. The quiet people. The ordinary people. The people who lived and worked and loved and died in a world that was neither as glorious nor as terrible as legend suggests. And as you drift, imagine them. The samurai, walking home through the quiet streets. The farmer, leaning on his hoe. The courtesan, her makeup removed, sitting alone in a small room. The child, playing in the shadow of a castle. They are gone now. All of them. The world they knew is gone. But they were real. And for a moment we remembered them. Sleep well. Rest easy. The past is still there, waiting, full of stories we haven't yet told. Good night.